once you give people this power to go and complain over totally hypothetical harms, they just crush the industry. It took some decades, but now it is just strangled, being crushed under the weight of this horrible regulation. And it is just, we've given so much power to just a few impossible to please people that show up at meetings. Terrible. One of the main things that governments do is try to protect the character of the neighborhood by preventing people from doing different things. So I think a lot of it is that government is actively working for homogenization. I'd say another thing is anytime you make housing more expensive, you are then multiplying out the cost of doing something unusual.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jesse Fragale, and you're listening to Working Capital, the real estate podcast. My special guest today, returning guest, is Bryan Caplan. Bryan is the professor of economics at George Mason University and New York Times bestseller. Bryan, welcome back.
Fantastic to be here, Jesse.
I noticed I said the professor, like you're the only one at George Mason. I feel like you got some good company over there.
Yeah, I do. Great friends.
So, Bryan, it's been a year since we last spoke. For those that didn't catch the last one, I believe it's episode 159, Working Capital. You can check that out on Spotify. We talked about a few of the different books that you've done. And again, for those that don't know, this is the book that that your most recent book. And you've done something interesting. The first time I read the last book that you did with, is it Adi Branzai?
Yeah, Adi Branzai.
Adi Branzai. So what you've done is basically done a graphic novel for relatively dense economics. Before we even start, could you just tell listeners what was the impetus to take a lot of this stuff? And for those that are actually watching, you can just see it. It looks like a comic book or graphic novel, as my older friends like to say. What was the genesis of that?
Housing regulation is this incredibly important topic. We've got a lot of scholarship on it, and almost nobody reads it because they're bored to death. What can one do? This research can't do any good for the world if nobody even finds out what it says. I wanted to take this work, which I think is intrinsically fascinating, just to visualize a totally different world where people can actually build stuff again. It is so legally hard to build much of anything in the modern world. To visualize a world of deregulation and just imagine how much better that world would be. I mean, also, an added bonus here was so many of the complaints about construction are aesthetic. Oh, that would be ugly. That would spoil the landscape. I wanted to actually draw what the world would look like if regulation were drastically reduced or eliminated, and then have people see it and say, like, does that actually look bad to you? My view is actually it is normal that human beings improve upon the world when they develop. The most beloved areas of the world are not unchanged, unaltered nature. It's when human beings harmoniously combine their own developments with pre-existing natural beauty. So a lot of the pages there, I'm trying to make people see that with their own eyes. Fight aesthetics with aesthetics.
So, Bryan, you've written on a bunch of different topics, the myth of the rational voter. I think the first graphic novel that I read of yours, maybe the only one other than this, was on immigration. I believe it was Open Borders, the ethics and science of immigration. Is that right?
Science and ethics of immigration. Oh. That's right. New one's the science and ethics of housing regulation.
So why housing?
Comes down to this. There is a lot of work saying that this regulation has destroyed many trillions of dollars. Normally, these numbers don't make any difference to people, but they make a difference to me. A regulation that destroys $1 billion is bad, but the world is full of harm like that. There's no reason to write a special book on it. Housing is different. Housing is the second most important industry in the world. It's the second most important necessity after food. If you're on an island, first thing is get some food. Second thing is build shelter. The government in most countries treats developers like criminals. The level of regulation that they endure is crazy. And the result is not just the developers suffer. The result is that everybody that would like to have a place to live suffers, because those are the people that make the stuff that we want to live in.
So being in Toronto here, we hear especially in Canada, housing is just like the US is a big piece of the political conversation.
Probably worse.
Probably worse. I know our stats are pretty intense when you look at how much individuals are invested in housing. It's becoming more and more unaffordable. The common thing that you hear is we have so much land in Canada, and we're all huddled around our border. What is that argument? How do we have housing shortages when we have so much land, potential for development? What's going on there?
I will confess. So I don't know Canadian law as well as the US. I think it's very likely that you have extensive government ownership of land, which makes it very hard for much new to happen or for new ground to be broken. But the more basic point is there is a reason why most people in Canada want to live on the southern border. They want of the country, which is they want to get to the least cold places. You may say, yeah, well, that's just too bad. It's scarce. Thing is that because space is three-dimensional, we actually have great technologies for allowing basically unlimited number of people to live in the most desirable areas. Just build up. Often you don't even need to build very far up. Just build in. Don't make people put a house per acre. Let them put 5 houses per acre. It is very striking that normally in earlier times, you could just pack houses onto land. And so if you look at older homes, that's standard. Whereas when you want to build something new, then normally there's a government saying, oh, we don't want to let you have that many houses on that much land. If you're wondering, does this regulation matter? It is standard for builders to build as many houses as the government will let them. They go right up to the edge, which is very convincing evidence that the regulation is actually a pair of handcuffs. They want to do more. They just aren't allowed.
So there's a great, I think he's a character in this. I'm halfway through the book here, but Edward Glaser, Triumph of the City was one of my favorite books. And one of the takeaways from me, years after you remember 3 or 4 things. And one of the takeaways for me was the fact that cities are actually extremely good per capita for the environment. And when you say that to some people, even listening right now, they might go, that doesn't make sense. Could you unpack, what Edward and you were saying there?
Right. And also, don't forget Matt Kahn,
that's right.
Glaser's co-author. Right. So here's the main thing. Like, if you're worried about human beings impacting nature, well, do you want to spread human beings out over a really large area or let them squeeze into a small area? That's step one. But then on top of that, you get a lot of savings from heating and cooling from packing homes together, because if you're sharing walls, then you're getting less heat loss or less cooling loss. So there's that too. And then just in general for new construction generally is using better materials than old construction. And therefore, again, it is actually going to be more energy efficient. So put all this together, and there's multiple ways in which both urbanization and just new development in general actually should, by the logic of their own position, make Greens very supportive of letting people build a lot more stuff.
So I work in commercial real estate, and often,
yay! Thank you for your service.
Well, we try. Oftentimes, this happens in residential as well, but oftentimes you have an initial concept for a plan, a design, a building, and it's a building that's curved. It has all this nice glass knit exterior, and then as you get closer and closer to practicality, I dare say it gets a little bit more boring. And I think that was something Russ Roberts said, this idea that if we allow laissez-faire building of any and all things, that we're just going to end up with very monolithic style of housing and commercial properties. What say you?
I think it's a pretty weird concern, because one of the main things that governments do is try to protect the character of the neighborhood by preventing people from doing different things. So I think a lot of it is that government is actively working for homogenization. I'd say another thing is anytime you make housing more expensive, you are then multiplying out the cost of doing something unusual. So if housing was half the cost, and then it's like, well, it's 20% extra to go and do something exciting. Well, like if it's cheap, then like 20% extra isn't that bad. If it's 20% on top of otherwise astronomical costs, that's where you're more likely to say, I think we better hold back here. On top of it, another thing that's very standard to do with regulation is to have very rigid use segregation, whereas there is a lot of actual demand for mixed use, where you go and have commercial establishments on bottom floors and residences on top. Some places will allow this. Europe is more friendly to this, but the US just has this very rigid view of we got to keep homes and businesses and industry as separate as possible. That would be terrible to go and let them be next to each other. And like, why don't you go and let the landowner decide what he wants to do? I mean, especially when you've got a large developer. The economics here is, look, if it's just one person owning one small plot of land, then maybe you should be worried that they're going to go and screw up all their neighbors' lives. But if it's a developer who's got a couple hundred acres, then why in the hell is government getting involved? Why not just let them do whatever they want? Nobody around them is going to be dealing with anything that unless they already bought into it. And yet that is one of the areas where government is actually most likely to say, oh, this is everything you can do. You can't do this. Too many houses, no, fewer houses, space them apart. Can't do commercial buildings. Like, why not? Like, what do you care? It's like, we're here, we're from the government and we're here to help. Just the sheer arrogance of it all is galling. I mean, I actually do have, a lot of pity for someone who has to deal with this stuff in the real world. I just write about it. I don't have to actually fill out paperwork and then have someone who doesn't know what he's talking about say, oh no, we can't allow this. You do, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because I specialize in the office market, which has seen a huge change over the last 5 years in demand, in buildings, obsolescence of buildings, potential conversions of buildings. And it's funny when the rubber meets the road and you actually have government looking at, so I'll give you a good example. We have rental replacement when it comes to residential. In the commercial world, we have the same thing, that if you add residential to a office building, or if you demolish an office building, you have to replace X amount of office space. And right now, there's a push in our market.
Wait, so just explain that regulation to me again. So if you want to demolish some office space, you got to build some other office space to make sure that office space stays constant?
Yeah, so for...
But what if people don't want office space anymore?
And that's the thing. So
tough luck?
Yeah, so I guess I think it is an outgrowth of, very similar to California, which I believe you're from California originally, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so for us, it's easier to understand on the residential side. We have rental replacement. If you build and densify, you have to make sure that in our market that you have the units that were initially, so if you have a 6 unit to 50 unit, those 6 units have to be replaced and also at the market rate that they're at. Okay. So that's, old news. On the office side,
in other words, below market rate for,
which exactly. Yeah. And that's a whole nother conversation in Toronto. But with with office replacement, there's when you do densify an office or demolish and put residential, they require a certain percentage, but we get to
so not 100.
Yeah, not 100, but we get to the point where COVID was such an obvious reality check that there are certain areas where there's no reason to have that office there. It was a C-class building. It should change use. And even the government now, there's a movement for some buildings to say, listen, get rid of this. Like, to your point, if the owner and if they deem they need or require office there, they can do that. But the regulation is becoming pointless. So that's essentially like what we're dealing with on the commercial end. I'm curious of your view when it comes to, so in most of our offices, I think over 60 of our offices are in the US. So I'm pretty familiar with the US market. I know in our market, 25 or 30%, which is an astounding percentage of all new development on the residential side, so condos, apartments, are development charges. So just development charges that go straight to the government, land levy taxes, all this stuff. So is your argument that if you remove those costs, that builders will now have a more latitude to build things that are more appealing visually, or just, they can do whatever they want with that, with that potential cost that's no longer there?
And that figure citing, what did you say, 25 to 30%?
Yeah. So I would say.
So is that, are those actually checks you're writing to government, or that's including all the costs of compliance?
All the cost, I guess, kind of all the costs of compliance. So basically the permits, everything that goes into putting a shovel in the ground and building say a condo building in Toronto.
Yeah. So that's definitely part of it. Although even there, I would say that the much bigger reason why housing is so expensive is just all of the stuff that, just getting permission to build it all. So there's one thing, you get permission and then it costs more, but Really bad is there's a lot of places where you really just can't build at any price. There's no place where you say, look, here's $1 billion. Let me build my skyscraper. No, there's 27 layers of approval before we could even begin to contemplate that. I did talk to one architect who said, yeah, probably the stuff you're talking about, Brian, is doubling the cost. And then all of this other stuff that we're dealing with is adding on another 20%. So I say that's pretty consistent with your story about the levies, but then that's actually really only scratching the surface. There's things. So probably if you have something where you have an acre of land and the government says you can only put one home there, right? The fact that you could have easily put down 5 homes there, I'm guessing that those extra 4 homes don't get put into your cost of regulatory compliance.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Right. And again, this is one where it's like, well, isn't it nice to have some spare land? It's like, sure, let people pay extra for it if they really want it. But on the other hand, don't keep big homes on small lots off the market because you have some aesthetic view of people should be further away from their neighbors. It's a lot of money to go and have that land left vacant.
So, Brian, what do you say to individuals that, because we have certain regulation in our market, and I know other markets that come with certain size requirements, maximum minimums, every which way. You say you let these greedy fat cat landlords and developers build whatever they want. We're going to have 200 square foot of condos stacked on top of each other like drawers, a la Seinfeld episode and with Kramer and his.
The Japanese, so not cabinet hotels, but
he's got feeding them breakfast
right.
and So, I mean, what's the argument there? If you let these guys completely go with a profit motive, what happens? In terms of where are the boundaries of what they can do and can't?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I would say, like, very hard presumption. It's your land. Do whatever the hell you want on it. If there's a neighbor with a problem, then they can take you to court. The fact that's hard is a feature, not a bug, because people are just prone to so many unreasonable complaints. In terms of the scenario you're painting, I say, look, it would probably happen in the world's most expensive places, especially if you're the only one who had permission to build anything. So in San Francisco, you very well might actually make these very tiny places because so many people want to just have a little place there. And it's so expensive right now, they would gladly go and get the cost down by making a lot of sacrifices. The main thing to understand is life is full of trade-offs. If you've got a lot of people that are willing to go and make and have a large reduction in their quality of life in order to save an even larger amount of money, no reason for government to get in the way of that. Why is that so bad? We all make these trade-offs. Right now, the usual trade-off is I'll go and have a 3-hour-a-day commute so that I can live in a single-family house. That's a trade-off. So it's not like the system we have has gotten rid of trade-offs. It's just taken a whole bunch of very reasonable options off the table. I mean, some people would say, yeah, I would rather go and do that massive drive than live in a tiny little shack. On the other hand, there's people like, I hate that drive. Give me the shack. Right? And then once you go and allow those people to go and take the shack option, guess what? There's less demand out in the more remote locations. So those prices come down. There's a special word for this. It's called filtering. It is absolute reality. It is not some kind of blackboard idea that if you go and allow one part of an area to build a lot more housing, this has ripple effects throughout an entire region and indeed over an entire country. I mean, really, you can just go and see this with the vintage of different homes. So normally cheap homes are old homes. But when they were built, they were not cheap. When they were built, they were usually really nice. So then what's going on? Well, the very fact that you allowed someone to go and build some luxury homes 50 years ago is the reason why there's some affordable homes right now, because they're the same homes.
When it comes to affordability, on that point, if you were to say, you can wave a wand and do 2 or 3 things right off the hop that would help affordability the most, what would rank up there for you?
I think the biggest one is actually just get rid of minimum lot size. Say that it's up to the builder how many homes they want to squeeze onto the lot. Even if they had to be single family, I would still say that we just waste a crazy amount of land. People do not appreciate that land very much, especially in the internet age. Most people are just total homebodies. They barely go outside. Whether they have a lot of land or a little land, they're not going to be doing much. They're not going to be playing volleyball. It would be so much better if you could just let builders put a whole lot of homes right next to each other. When you see those, basically when developers are allowed to, that's just what they do, especially in high price areas. Like the homes are 3 feet away from each other. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, isn't that terrible? Well, it's not what I would do if I were the richest person in the world. But if I wanted to have a home to raise my family in and I could get it for a third off the price, then yeah, I'd totally go and do that. And even say that there's some upsides, like, there's going to be a lot more kids within walking distance if we do it this way. So while we don't have as much land, we got more kids. It's not even clear that on balance, it's a lower quality of life when you think about it. So after that, then deregulating multifamily gets a lot more scrutiny, at least in the US, and I'm guessing Canada too. Is that true?
Yeah.
Yes. So Europe is cooler with multifamily, actually. Mm-hmm. And then the final really big one is the skyscrapers. Just let people build up as high as they want. And which is not going to happen in the middle of nowhere. You're not going to build a skyscraper in rural Kansas, but that would mean that there will be a bunch of new skyscrapers in San Francisco and Manhattan. If you just take an aerial look of San Francisco, which you can do when you're reading my book, because I've got some drawings based upon aerial photography, it's just bizarre what this city looks like. They've got skyscrapers in under 10% of the land area of the peninsula, and the rest of it, they've just frozen in place these stupid 2 and 3 story homes from like I guess not quite the 19th century because of the earthquake, but they basically look like late 19th century homes. And it's like, why can't we just buy up blocks and blocks and just put 100-story buildings here? And it's like, oh no, that would disrupt the character of the neighborhood. It's like, give me a break. Never mind. So it's like, having homeless people all over, that's okay and has to be tolerated. But on the other hand, you can't let a skyscraper go up. That's horrible.
I'm curious.
San Francisco did deregulate a little bit, but they deregulated to the tune of 1 skyscraper per year instead of 0 per year. This pace would just take 1,000 years to get to a reasonable point.
Yeah, I think it's also for me at least, the arbitrariness of it. And like my neighborhood, which is outside, it's in Toronto, but it's outside of the city. For the longest time, there was just a rule that you couldn't build over 12 stories in this area. Just somebody said 12. Some committee got to that number, and that's at the time, that threshold was kept until the population got to the point where they're like, okay, it's 15 now, but there's an arbitrary.
Yeah. And like, why that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's easy, especially for economists, to think, oh, there's somebody who's doing careful cost benefit calculation. I don't see any sign that it's more than bureaucrats drunk with power just saying, well, I feel like 15 is now appropriate.
Yeah. And I'll say here,
that's how you decide how everybody lives. And it's like, well, if you don't like it, vote us out of office, like in an election where maybe 5% of people show up. And
yeah, and that's part of the problem in our world in the Canadian politics as well, because we play ping pong. One group goes in, they're more right leaning or more free market, and they change things, and then the other group comes in, and then they change them back, and we kind of, you guys have a little bit more of a natural gridlock in your political system that I both have their benefits, but I wanted to also say, like,
I mean, I'd say the ping pong sounds like a big improvement, honestly. If half the time there was someone actually genuinely friendly to development, I think the real story is there's basically some monolithic hostility to developers with varying degrees of how hostile, but just the general presumption of developers are bad and have to be watched like hawks and have to be stopped. I mean, it's just such a strange idea to dislike people that are making shelter. I mean, it would be like an ideology like farmers. You got to watch them. They're bad. And it's like, why? Because they're trying to grow food for us? Like, what have you got against them?
It's interesting. I'm an investor and a landlord, so I see myself as I'm even worse than a developer from certain viewpoints. I don't build anything, but when you get to what we do in terms of just in purchasing properties, and you actually see what the benefits to the economy, developers, to me, I don't call them investors, and I mean that with complete respect. They're oftentimes speculating because they have to take into account things like black swan events like COVID. They have to take into account floating debt open debt for 4 or 5 years while a development, is going through different economic cycles in the general economy. So I think there's a lot of for me, I know for most people, it's odd to say, like, I have a lot of respect for developers because they take massive risks, and that's why their returns reflect that risk.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's like without them, there's no housing. Like, what? Am I going to build a house myself?
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to chat with you about is, so like you said, you only write about this, and I jokingly say only, but I've been in those meetings that you have discussed in here and on different podcasts about approvals for different different commercial buildings, different residential buildings. Now that whole world, the NIMBYism, banana, for those that don't know, I think it's build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. The sentiment that you have, I think you mentioned that, I can't remember which economist, but went through like the minutes of these meetings throughout the states. What's going on there?
So the book is called Neighborhood Defenders. And so what they did is they went to the state of Massachusetts and they basically got transcripts of every land use meeting for many years. And that's an incredible number of words. So then they did some kind of computer textual analysis. And found out what are people even complaining about? And it has very little to do with protecting property values or anything like that. It's much more like there's a bird's nest that could be disturbed. We can't allow that. I don't care if it costs $1 billion. That's the kind of nonsense that's going on, is just these petty symbolic issues, which I know a lot of economists will say, oh, there's got to be some hidden strategy there. And it's like, I don't see any hidden strategy. Sounds more like these are just psychologically normal people, or really more unusually neurotic people, the kind of person that would go to a meeting and try to prevent someone from making $1 billion over a bird.
And the bird shuts down the whole development.
Yeah. Yes. And then the book, they also went through a bunch of actual anecdotes of what happened, and it takes 7 years to finally go and build 3 houses for a project that was originally supposed to have 50 or 100. And basically each time they complain and drag their feet and say, we need another study. And you just realize there, for about 700 years, there was a system in the English speaking world for handling complaints about misuse of property. And the system was called the law of nuisance. And it just said that if your neighbors don't like what you're doing, they can take you to court.
Yeah.
This had some obvious drawbacks. Well, what if the neighbor goes and is going to do something terrible for you? You have to wait for it to actually happen. And then you got to drag it out in court and he can fight you out. That was the old system. And the answer, was it perfect? No. Right. And then you have a lot of regulation that comes in. This is going to make sure that it's going to stop bad things before they start. Sounds very plausible until you see what happens in the real world. And you realize once you give people this power to go and complain over totally hypothetical harms, they just crush the industry. It took some decades, but now it is just strangled, being crushed under the weight of this horrible regulation. And it is just we've given so much power to just a few impossible to please people that show up at meetings. Terrible.
Yeah. That reminds me of we have a healthcare expert coming on in expert quotations in a few weeks for the podcast. But in Canada, because we have free air quotes at the source, we have the percentage of people that go to the doctor for minor things is much higher. And it's kind of like to your point of once you open kind of the complaint, I'm sure a lot are legitimate, but once you open that floodgate when it comes to complaints, then I feel like that system immediately will get, everything will come through.
Yes. I mean, in the DC area, one of my favorite examples of this is there are noise complaints that get filed against Reagan Airport. And the number is something like half of all complaints were filed by one guy.
Yeah.
What kind of a person would do that? It's like you live near an airport. Of course, you're going to hear planes.
Yeah.
You're going to shut down the whole airport because of your complaint. How about you move? You knew this? This is not like the airport showed up after you bought it.
Yeah.
And what kind of a system goes and gives a person like that so much power? It's a totally dysfunctional system based upon, we always need to take extra care to listen to every complaint respectfully. It's like, no, that's a recipe for stagnation. You need to be eager to dismiss complaints as ridiculous in order to have a system of progress.
Well, I think also too, on the housing side, I always find it ironic that the not in my backyard people are the most vocal once they have their own backyard and they have once they have the ownership, then they're like, okay, now we don't want any more development, but right after I can buy something, and then we're kind of shutting the door.
There's some of that, although the truth is it's a tiny fraction of people who go to meetings.
Yeah.
They do tend to be owners, but most people own homes are completely unaware of policy and really barely care. Furthermore, there's some very cool research that I talk about in the book, finding that tenants are similarly supportive of regulation compared to owners. It's not just owners who are being salvaged. It's more like humans who just have a really screwed up idea about what socially beneficial policy is. And the idea is, well, the best thing for society is to take all complaints seriously.
Yeah.
No, the best thing for society is to assume that complainers are crazy. Let people build, and then once in a blue moon, some complaints are reasonable, and then we do something about it, and otherwise, tough luck. That's the best policy for society, is the theme of my book.
Why do you think there is a perception in the States and up here for sure that there's a legitimate case of this, but kind of there's this idea that developers and real estate people and government, there's kind of a connection there, that there's, whether it's true or not, why is that perception there?
Yeah, it's a very reasonable perception, because if you cannot do business without being in bed with the government, then everyone in business will be in bed with the government. This does not mean that the developers actually like what the government is doing overall. I mean, actually, what I would say is that writing this book gave me a great appreciation for how wonderful lobbying by developers is. How so? Well, normally economists just think of lobbyists as just being corrupt people trying to go and stop their competitors. But the thing about developers is that they make all their money on new construction. The whole idea of a developer, you get some new land, you buy, or you get it, you build on it, you sell it to somebody else, and then you move on. If they never build anything new, they never make any more money. And really what's going on here is that developers are there whining and dining and pushing and shoving to go and get the permits that allow new construction to continue at this slow pace, but it's still better than nothing. And really, if without them, without all that lobbying, we would basically just listen to the people show up at meetings, and that would just shut down almost all development.
So from as opposed to other industries, you're saying that developers basically are the ones that are prompting the kind of loosening of regulations or at
least making exceptions. Yeah. Making exceptions. It's not like they want to go and focus their energy on big changes in the law. Like, that's going to help everybody in the industry. It's like, make me an exception.
Yeah.
But still, a world where everyone's saying make an exception, make an exception, make an exception does get more exceptions.
For sure. And in our industry, it's not uncommon. It's actually part of normal practice that we always shoot for the moon and aim for something less. So if you want to build a 30-story building, you're going to ask for 70, and the government's going to be very satisfied when they tell you 40. But kind of pushing on that, and hopefully that kind of trickles down. But it seems like a very inefficient way to go about this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite stories that I heard when selling this book is I got a friend in Laramie, Wyoming. Sounds like the middle of nowhere, but it's actually a very nice area in Wyoming where the University of Wyoming is. And so there's a developer there with a big plot of land, and he wanted to put in 30 houses. And then the neighbor said, no, that's terrible. It's got to be stopped. And can you have any idea what their complaint's going to be? This is a complaint. I've never heard this complaint before, but they wanted to shut this whole thing down.
Yeah.
Light pollution. He's going to blot our view of the beautiful stars of Wyoming.
Yeah.
So you want to shut down 30 homes so that you can look at the stars? That's your story? And yes. And then finally, the local government said, let's have a compromise. You can build 23 homes instead of 30. So they just prevented the building of 7 homes for some totally negligible improvement in the visibility of stars. And the number of those people that actually have telescopes, come on. It's like, how about you go and drive another 10 minutes and stop trying to go and bother a neighbor that's trying to do something good for the world?
Yeah. Like housing. I thought you were going to go off to something about Laramie Smooth cigarettes for The Simpsons.
That's a good one, but no.
So I guess, bottom line here, in terms of what we can see as empirical evidence for things that are pointing towards what you're advocating here, who's doing it right? Is there a country, state, city that you see is doing at least some of the prescriptions that you have here?
Right. So, honestly, I'd say that Texas looks to me like overall the best. There's still some more regulated areas in Texas, but it definitely deserves its reputation for light regulation. It's very striking how if you drive from Austin to San Antonio, it's about a 90-minute drive, but in the middle, like last time I was there, homes were like $300,000 for a 4-bedroom home. Now, if you talk to Texans, like, that's still too high. It's like, compared to like most areas, 45 minutes from two major cities, it's incredible what you're getting there. And if you just drive a bit further, then prices drop even more than that. And again, it's not so much that they've got a lot of activism as they've just always done it this way. And probably there's a whole lot of good old boys that are in bed with local government just to continue this, which is a lot better than places where you have leaders with the principle of developers are evil and have to be stopped. I know a lot of people also like the regulation in Japan and say that that's going really well. It's hard to get English language sources for me to actually confirm how good it is. There's probably something to it. Also fair to say that their low population growth is playing a role too. So, I'd be a lot more impressed with Japan if they had rapid population growth and they kept their housing prices stable. I think the defenders will say, well, Tokyo had a lot of population growth and things are reasonably stable there. All right, you got something there, but still, I want to see big national population growth going hand in hand with housing prices going down. That's what I think really would be a sign of things being great. But yeah, I think it is. So like people often say, like what's going on in Japan is most of the regulations set at the national level. And so they are at least less subject to unreasonable localism and NIMBYs, plausible. But yeah, it's also one where it's like, I don't think I understand Japanese culture well enough just to take the word of Anglophones about what's going on. I think I really want to talk to a bunch of people that really know Japan. I've been there twice. So I spent about a month there so far. And even now I'm like, all right, I still don't really understand what's going on here. A lot of this stuff is just pretty weird. And like, what's happening? And like, why? And some things are easier to figure out. Like, there's no litter because the Japanese don't litter. I think I've got that one down pretty clearly. Like, you don't need any other big theory about the country, about the litter situation. But for other stuff, I don't know.
What's so you mentioned on the podcast with Russ Dubai, and I think it was more so in the context of the initial the earlier question I asked you about, they're just going to build very bland things, and I think your point was, look at Dubai, there's some of the most beautiful architecture. If I was to push back on that,
it's the most. They're the Dubai and Abu Dhabi, the two most futuristic cities I have ever seen. Until then, I was kind of thinking it was Warsaw, Poland, which you might think of it as the home of the big Stalinist wedding cake video, but there's so much more going on there. They've got the tallest building in the EU now, and it's very futuristic, but it does not compare to Abu Dhabi and Dubai.
So if I push back on that and say, because the first thing I think of is in developments I've dealt with, a lot of times we see that at the upper crest of the higher end, because at that point, I don't know, you're an economist. I assume it's something with the elasticity of demand on that side. But what about that lower end? What is the argument that same phenomenon can happen at the lower end of, say, your average income or even lower income in terms of affordability?
I mean, part of it is, I would say that it makes sense to allow there to be a market segment of cheap bland houses. Right? It's not all about things looking beautiful for tourists. There are plenty of cities in the world that no tourists would want to go to, and yet it's wonderful that they exist. And it's hard to go and write an essay about those cities, but the logic is sound. It totally makes sense for there to be cities that are places to live and not places to visit. But on top of it, like I said, like if you can get the price of housing down by half, down by 3/4, down by 9/10, then it makes it easy for even the poor to afford ornament. So I would also think about that.
So I had Richard Epstein, NYU professor, on the podcast a couple of years ago, and we were talking about rent control regulations as it relates to residential tenants and landlords. Is there any connection here with that kind of world and what you're discussing here in the book?
Yeah, sure. Rent control is the classic normal person solution to the problem of high housing prices. It's the kind of thing that appeals to people who know no economics, don't want to know any economics. The price is too high. There ought to be a law. And yet, economists have been thinking about this for a long time, studying it for a long time. Basic point. Passing a law saying that you cannot charge more for housing does not make housing more available. It makes it less available. What it means is that a few lucky people are able to get below market housing and everybody else is tough luck. And in the long run, you do create enormous pressure to go and either convert housing to owner occupied or just to go and let it decay and tear it down. So yeah, it is a terrible, simple-minded idea, which not only doesn't address the basic problem of lack of actual construction and just the low amount of housing, but it goes against it and let's go and create conditions where people actually want housing to become less abundant rather than more.
Yeah. And that's one thing I always tell colleagues, not colleagues, I tell friends and family that, I work, like I said, in the commercial sector. So when we do real estate, it's a contract between you and I. If you breach that contract, you're in default. I have remedies. You can't contract out. Now, when it comes to residential, again, I compare to California. The world that we live in here is actually, no, you can't put that in a contract. And there's a prohibition on putting that in a contract. So
but only for residential. You can do it for commercial.
Only for residential. For commercial, we can, the Commercial Tenancies Act has certain things that you can't do. Like for instance, a subtenant, you can't unreasonably withhold consent for a commercial tenant to find a subtenant, provided that they meet all the requirements and don't pose a risk. But there are certain things that, like for instance, just an easy one, you can say no pets in a commercial lease. You can't say that in a residential lease in Canada. That's just it's just not allowed. The reason I bring it up is we have certain stipulations that are just static. For instance, we have rent destabilization, I believe is the correct term, where we can pretty much raise rents every year by 1.8%, somewhere between 1.5 and 2.2 until the tenant leaves. Then you can mark to market. And that's a big challenge.
And that does that vary with the Canadian inflation rate or not?
Yeah. So it is pegged-ish,
but can't vary 1-to-1.
It does not vary 1-to-1. And we did not get any free rides or we didn't get any ride when COVID was shooting inflation.
Yeah, I mean, you probably got the opposite one. So did you have the same rules of tenants could not pay rent and couldn't be evicted for the duration?
Well, we already have a 11-month backlog, so that kind of predated COVID to begin with. But all these things have knock-on effects. And when it comes to development, like I was saying, the ping pong thing, our governments allow for, I believe it's 2017, that there was no rent control in buildings built after 2017 or 2018. Somebody can fact check me on that. But what did that do? That made people pivot from buying existing apartment buildings that were to developed. And that kind of went back and forth when our political landscape changed. But it seems like those type of impacts, they just create a lot of just muddy water for developers.
Yeah, one of the amazing things about housing regulation is that I've been studying this for years now. Yet whenever I talk to anyone with any practical experience or just someone from a different part of the world, I always find out a bunch of new crazy regulations. And like my first reaction is like, there can't be a regulation like that. And I'm like, oh yeah, of course there can be. There's endless regulation. It's all premised on this bizarre idea that if the government just goes and says that people get something, that they will get it. It's like, it's much more complicated than that. The basic economics of it is if you can deal with two people, one that has the government tilting the whole landscape in his favor and the other one who doesn't, you want to do business with a person that doesn't have the government tilting things in his favor. And this is such an elementary idea. It's common sense. And yet almost all politics is just based on the naive idea that it's always better for the government to go and stand up to evil fat cats and protect the little guy. It's like, and as a result, the little guy has to pay through an arm and a leg. It's like, well, what if I don't have a pet and I'm willing to go and forgo my right to have a pet to get a giant cut in my rent? No, wrong. That's evil.
Yeah.
It's like, why is that evil? Why should non-pet owners, if they're going to subsidize all the property damage of the pet owners?
Yeah.
Oh, you're so simple-minded. This is just about those greedy fat cats. Like, no, you're simple-minded. I see clearly.
Yeah. And to be clear, this podcast is pro-pet, but it's just, it reminds me a little bit, and we can wrap up with this, but it reminds me when you said rent control, just because I have time on my hands and my reality TV is U.S. politics. When there was this big talk of the minimum wage. And when you really peel that back and you look at the percentage of Americans that are actually on minimum wage is very, very, very low. It's not.
Percentage on the federal minimum wage is now down to about 1%. There's a bunch of states with very high minimum wages.
Yeah.
And so we do actually now get this contrast. But yes, the federal minimum wage in the US has been almost abolished. Thank goodness. And hopefully it stays that way.
And what I wanted to end on was Frederick Bastiat, you talk about the seen and the unseen. And the reason I connect it to this is we can now start making the argument, at least on that point, that, you know, when you see McDonald's having to pay X minimum wage in say bluer states, all of a sudden you see these electronic machines show up and you start seeing companies pivot to other things. And now we're actually seeing that when I was younger, you didn't really see that. It was kind of like, oh no, that's, you know, it should be higher, but you didn't really see the negative consequences. Can you talk about how you connected that, I believe it's an essay, to what we're talking about here?
Yeah. So French economist Frederick Bastiat has this famous essay on what is seen and what is not seen. And his point is that especially the super popular government policies that seem like it's just something for nothing, government playing Santa Claus, there are almost always hidden downsides that are large and neglected. His classic example is, how about we go and like when we've got, you know, no threat of war, we got to be at peace for a long time, our neighbors friendly, we go and we cut back on the size of the military. And then people say, no, like those military, though, that's useful jobs and people need those incomes. And then they go and they buy stuff from their neighbors and we need those bases. And it's like, well, if you get rid of the wasteful government spending, people will spend their money on something else. And then there will be good side effects for the people receiving that money and so on. And then we will go and move resources to something that advances human welfare instead of just paying someone money to go and sit on a base when there is no actual danger. That's the hypothetical, crucially. All right. And what I say in the chapter Bastiat's Buildings is that so much housing regulation fits the same principle, where people just think of, well, isn't it just wonderful to go and make sure that every house is an acre of land, then we get all these beautiful homes. Like, that's what you see. What you don't see are all the people who can't afford to live in your area because they just aren't there. Right? That is the kind of thing that Bastiat helps you to realize. Like, when you raise the price, it changes the behavior. And often the people that are suffering, you never meet them because they just live in a totally different part of the country, because your part of the country is just so damn expensive. They don't move there.
And I highly recommend anybody that's interested in economics and kind of the legal world too. Frederick Bastiat's The Law, I believe it's just The Law, is an incredible book. And what's interesting, you can tell me if this is correct, that essay, I read that was the first time that the broken window fallacy was ever put forth, because he talks about that in that book.
I thought it was actually in Economic Sophisms, or actually no,
in that essay.
I think it was The Law. I thought it was either what is seen. Yeah, I think it's actually in I think it's the first chapter of what is seen. And
yeah.
What is not
So sorry,
seen.
That's what I meant. That essay.
Yeah,
I was because I was like, oh, he's probably referencing that other economist that said that. I was like, oh wait, no, this was the guy. This is where this is where it came from.
Guy.
Cool. So Bryan, coming up on time here. For those that are interested, obviously the book is a Google search away. Is there any place that you would send anybody that would kind of want more information or that's interested in this stuff?
So the book's available in all regular booksellers. I find Amazon most convenient. Important thing to understand about this book, like 5-year-olds will read it. Professors will read it. I really was trying hard to get that full range, to have it work on a lot of different levels. I wanted it to be high enough quality so that actual researchers specializing in this topic would learn something from it and say that it's accurate, while also appealing to precocious children and everyone in between. I did actually get a friend who sent me a picture of his 3-year-old. He says, your book is my favorite book. I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I was going for. I think this is a book that is great for course adoption. It's great for high schoolers. It's great for anyone that is curious but runs out of patience for reading an actual book. Also, on the other hand, for people that have endless patience for books, it's one where you can go and read it and read all the endnotes and see where I'm getting this stuff from. I'm not making this up. There's very solid research that is the foundation for this, but I did want to go and package it in a way where people would realize this is not just some dry topic for a few researchers. This is a pathway to a way better world, which is totally technologically feasible. We just need to take a flamethrower to these mountains of idiotic regulations.
So I wanted to just mention, before I forgot, that you call them notes in here. You basically, I think you did this with the open borders as well. For the nerds out there that like looking at, they're basically citations in here, and there's pages of citations in here, which I found kind of incredible because there's not enough density in little bubble. Whereas you're like, the open border one, I think every second page, I'm like, that can't be right. And then you go look and you look at a study and you actually see where the data is coming from. I found that's awesome. Obviously the 7-year-old's not doing that, but for the people that think that it's not a real economics book, I think that this is an amazing way to do it, especially with something so visual like real estate.
Yep. I totally agree.
Okay. Well, my guest today has been Bryan Caplan. Bryan, thank you again for being part of Working Capital.
Totally my pleasure. And thank you for your service in everything you do to build housing for us, because I like having a roof over my head, and I hope your listeners do too.